Hi students, and welcome to your PowerPoint on the French Revolution. I hope that this will give you a little bit of historical, cultural, and societal context that will help affect the meaning that you're constructing from the text of Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. I'm going to move through this as quickly as I can so that we can get through this in about 15 minutes or under. First of all, we need to know what started the revolution. We had estates general in France at the time. There was the clergy, which was the first estate, the nobles or the aristocracy, which was the second estate. Everybody else in the kingdom, the third estate, was represented by that group, the third estate. Here's the problem. The third estate was the majority of the people in the country. The clergy and the aristocracy had an invested interest in making sure that the king got what he wanted. So in actuality, the king really could control everything that was happening in the kingdom. So it was either an absolute monarchy where the king had the divine right to rule, or it was an oligarchy where only the wealthy and the rich people in the country could actually have a say. So one day there was supposed to be a meeting between the first, second, and third estates, and when the third estate came to meet, the doors were closed, almost as if they were making a decision and they didn't want to include the third estate at all. So all of the people in the third estate got together in a tennis court, and they agreed basically that they would stick together and have a union of sorts until the Constitution was established that allowed them to have a voice. By doing so, they forced King Louis XIV in order to recognize the National Assembly and its authority. So King Louis XIV, not to be confused with King Louis XVI, he had to step aside as an absolute monarch. He was forced to recognize that the first, second, and third estates all had to meet together, and he forced the first and the second estates to comply. So later on, the third estate gave a declaration of the rights of man, and even though this has the concept of democracy and a say for the common man that to us we find noble and wonderful, monarchs instantly felt threatened by this move toward rule by the people because they felt that it would bring disorder and anarchy to society. So here's a picture of what's going on with this Declaration of the Rights of Man. It says, social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good, which means the concept of aristocracy having special privileges or even special jobs that they were not even qualified to possess, that could be eliminated if it's not for the general good. It also says that nobody's allowed to exercise authority which does not proceed directly from the nation itself. This includes the king. That means that the king can be deposed if the nation, meaning the people and of the nation, decide that he should not have that authority. Law is also a very important theme, the role of law in the rights of the people. One of the Declaration of the Rights of Man was that every citizen has a right to participate in the foundation of the laws. And also this blanket policy. The law must be applied the same for everybody, whether it protects or punishes. And what is the role of the law is one of those questions that's firmly placed in Les Miserables. So what made it the worst? First of all, people started to really disrespect King Henry XVI, not to be confused, or King Louis XVI, not to be confused with King Louis XIV, who was the one with the tennis court oath. This is a few generations later. You had a king, King Louis XVI, and there were a lot of reading material called penny papers and yellow journalism that was handed out in the streets and exaggerated the flaws and even told rumors and gossip and lies about the monarchs that basically meant that the public opinion was really denigrated. Because this is what people were seeing. They were seeing that spending was taking place all over the place. Marie Antoinette, his wife, was originally from Austria. She was bred to be married and bridge the gap between France and Austria, and so they saw her as an intruder or an interloper, for example. And on top of that, people started to say all kinds of horrible things about Marie Antoinette. Her job as the queen was to produce an heir. The problem was that she was unable to do so because King Louis basically at the beginning did not show any interest in her whatsoever. He neglected her for the longest time. She didn't know what she was doing wrong, and she was blamed for everything, even though it turns out that King Louis actually had a medical problem that made it difficult for him to produce an heir. And rather than solving the problem, he just allowed her to feel horrible for the majority of the beginning of their marriage. And as a result, the penny papers latched onto this and thought that, hey, Marie Antoinette must be an adulteress. She must be seeking attention elsewhere. Or she has this one friend who's a girl, so maybe she's a lesbian and that's why she can't produce an heir. So typical stuff, blaming the female when something goes wrong, ha ha ha. But it did happen to Marie Antoinette. This was her sole responsibility as a princess and as a queen. Let them eat cake. Supposedly, she had said this when people were poor and out of bread. When she heard of the bread shortage, supposedly people said that Marie Antoinette just kind of scoffed it off and said, let them eat cake. The fact was, she never said let them eat cake. She actually was a really tender mother, and she also tried to pay her staff well. Keep in mind that there were people that were in her employ, and she was keeping them there and paying their salaries and trying to do a really good job about it. She also was born and raised in an environment where you had to compete with other royals from other countries. Think about it this way. If you have a diplomat or an ambassador, you clearly want them to be able to live and have that representation of style for your country. And so you don't want them living in a shack and showing up to diplomatic meetings in rags. Well, that's how Marie Antoinette felt, and that's how she lived her life and how all the monarchs lived. And this was not considered unusual. But to the people, there became such a huge gap that it eventually did become a major problem. It was true she spent a lot of money. She was very bored, she was very depressed some of the time due to her lifestyle, due to her husband issues, and for this reason she was known for gambling sums of money that were quite large. And by the time she started cutting back, by then it was a little too late. People kind of already noticed. And eventually, to get rid of her and make her sound even worse, what people had to do was to disseminate information that would make the public opinion think, and especially that she would be a horrible mother, that the next prince that would come to power would be just as degenerate as his parents, basically. So eventually, they did try to escape at one point, but it was unsuccessful. And eventually, this huge march of women came to Versailles, the palace, and they stormed their house. So imagine all of these women. They actually walked a great deal. They were known as the fishwives. And they threatened the monarchy with their stolen weapons from the city armory. And basically, the king and his queen got taken out of their palace and put in Paris under house arrest. So they were prisoners in their own home. The common people eventually executed them to form a republic, and I put this in quotation marks because, as you know, whenever a government structure changes, there's usually disorder before there becomes order. So this is kind of what happened in 1793. So a republic was declared in 1792, and you saw the rise of Maximilian Robespierre, the Jacobins, and the Reign of Terror. This meant anybody who was associated with the king, but especially the aristocracy. The people really took out their vengeance on the aristocracy, and if anybody was seen to be aiding aristocracy, you could possibly be beheaded. And this guillotine supposedly caused so much blood to run into the streets that it wouldn't even drain, and there was a stench that anybody coming close to that main square area could smell for miles. So it really was very bloody and terrifying. It did kind of become anarchy and corruption for a while. If the king's not going to rule, now how are we going to figure out who's going to rule? Ironically, Robespierre, who was responsible for many of these guillotine deaths, ended up also becoming guillotined in the end for corruption. So back to our essential question. As you read, you need to anticipate how the governmental shift affected the people of France. Keep in mind that there's chaos and there's disorder. We want to have a voice of the people, but how much voice should those people have, and how can we do this in an orderly fashion? What is now in Les Miserables the role of the aristocracy? What is the role of the king? What is the role of the clergy? Keep that in mind. How does the conflict between democracy, anarchy, and authority affect the poor, the women, and the children of the country? How long do you think it will take for this country to recover? Do you think that certain characters are pro-democracy, pro-king, pro-oligarchy? How does this attitude and shift change the mentalities of people? Do people become more survival of the fittest? What side do you think Victor Hugo is on in all of this? These are some questions that you really need to answer for yourself.